Good morning. I'm Saxenian. I'm the moderator for today's session on Mariana Mazzucato's new book, Mission Economy. First, a public service announcement. SASE would like to thank this year's virtual organizers, the KHK Center for Global Cooperation Research, the IAQ, and the DIFIS. You can learn more about these academic institutions by clicking on their logo on the conference homepage. So I'm really delighted to introduce you to the members of this distinguished panel. I'm going to be very brief with my introductions. Reading bios for these scholars would take the entire time allotted for the panel. But let me introduce first Suzanne Berger. Suzanne is Institute Professor at MIT. She works on globalization and politics and has been very important to many of the people on this panel in their careers. Second, we have Antonio Botelho, who is a professor in the graduate program in political sociology at IUP ERJ, Universidade Candido, Mendes, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Third, we have Michael Storper, who I'm not sure if he's here yet. Michael is the LSE Centennial Professor of Economic Geography. He is also affiliated with Sciences Po in Paris and the Department of Urban Planning and the School of Public Affairs at UCLA. Nick Ziegler is a professor of international and public affairs at the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And last but not least, our author this morning, or this afternoon for some of you, Mariana Mazzucato, is professor in the economics of innovation and public value at the University College London, where she's founding director of the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. She's written 2 successful books already prior to this one, the first about the role of the state in economic growth, and the other about the importance of value creation over value extraction in growth. And we're here today to discuss her latest book, Mission Economy, a Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. So we are going to make this session more interactive than normal. The panelists are going to both present some thoughts about the book and then do brief Q&As with Mariana before we then finally open it up to the audience. And on that audience Q&A, if you have questions for Mariana or for the panelists, please write them into the Q&A box at the bottom of Zoom. Use the chat box only for technical problems with the conference or the Zoom session. So in the spirit of making this a bit more interactive, I'm going to start with a brief question for Mariana. Mariana, your book offers a really engaging and inspiring story of the Apollo moonshot and the success of the Apollo moonshot in the US in the 1960s. And then it goes on to make an argument that I take as very similar to your first book, on the entrepreneurial state. And I'm curious what your motivation was in writing this second book, and in particular, who is the intended audience for Mission Economy?
Great question. So in other words, why did you write the book again? So I actually see them as very different books. So the book, The Entrepreneurial State, was really about kind of demythologizing what the role of the state has been and could be in the economy, away from, at best kind of fixing market failures, away from just being a lender of last resort. If you look at all the big technological revolutions we've had, which have gotten us general purpose technologies that have, really transformed production, distribution, and even consumption, it required what I call an entrepreneurial state, more of an investor of first resort, not lender of last resort, more of a risk taker, not just a de-risker, more of a market co-creator, not just market fixer. And yet economic theory continues to, at best, at worst, other stuff, at best, talk about market fixing. What this book tried to do was to say, well, guess what? It's actually kind of hard to do co-creating, to be an investor of first resort, and to do anything more than market fixing. And we need to learn from the experience on the ground. We need to learn from both kind of big, moments in the past, like the Apollo program, of what it actually meant, for example, for business to work with government in a way that was, I would say, well designed. It was much more symbiotic than what we see, for example, around healthcare innovation. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later. If you look at how intellectual property rights today are structured, it is hardly a symbiotic ecosystem. But also in terms of government, actually having some sort of purpose around, for example, societal missions. What does it actually mean for how to design policy, industrial strategy, innovation policy, development policy, sustainability policy in such a way that's not just flooding the system with subsidies, guarantees, recovery funds, bailouts, but actually to have purpose at the center of that design, both of the organization, so that intra-organizational issues that I kind of tease out in the book in terms of public sector organizations, but also inter-organizational issues around what does it actually then look like, for example, to design a procurement strategy in the way that NASA thought about it, but that I think today we could really benefit from if we're going to be tackling things like the digital divide and so on. But also, the fact that the actual challenges we have below this sustainable development goals are so much harder in many ways than getting to the moon, because they are wicked, they require political, behavioral, social, et cetera, change. What does it still mean to take as seriously the issue of kind of experimentation, trial and error, organizational culture that actually welcomes experimentation within the public sector in order to tackle those goals? What does an outcomes-oriented budgeting process look like? What does, again, rethinking procurement, but also grants, loans, and so on look like if we actually focus on the outcome? So none of that was in the first book. And the reason I wrote this is that, in some ways I felt like it wasn't fair that I would just go and talk to all these policymakers and say, co-creation, not fixing, investor of last resort, investor first resort, not lender of last resort, without giving an idea of what it actually looks like. So in some ways it's more of a recipe book. And it's based on my own experience and working with global policymakers all around the world. So it's almost like a memoir.
Great, thank you. So I take it that the short answer to my question is that this is more oriented towards policymakers as well as academics.
Oh yeah, I forgot about the audience, but it's basically for everyone. It's supposed to make us happy again. I don't know. I feel like I'm depressed. Everyone's depressed. It's for anyone who's gotten really depressed about policymakers not doing their thing and the private sector definitely not doing its thing.
Thank you, Mariana. That's wonderful. Okay, I am going to now turn this over to Suzanne Berger, our first panelist. Suzanne, your mute is on.
I'm delighted finally to meet Mariana Mazzucato, all of whose work has been of really great interest to me. And I think as social scientists, we all owe her a debt for having demonstrated how social science can contribute to and in fact possibly transform policymaking. And in many pages, in fact, of Mission Economy, she does document how her work and insights have contributed to diverse public policy arenas. I think, though, that the greatest contribution of the book, taken together with her other writings, is to change our understanding of the role of government from that of a market failure fixer to that of a risk taker. Most of the market failures that government deals with involve little or no risk. They are just Mankerolson type problems in collective action, which private actors can't solve because of free riding. If apple farmers get together to hire an airplane to seed the clouds so that rain and not hail falls on their apples, some of the farmers are certain to try to free ride, since we can't make rain fall on the farms whose owners have paid their dues and not fall on and hail fall on the non-dues paying. So government has to do the job of hiring the plane and seeding the hail clouds. But there's no risk or uncertainty involved here. What the moonshot is and I think that metaphor for the book suggests a really different role for government, namely taking on activities to accomplish tasks where it's uncertain whether we can do them at all, whether, and when it's completely uncertain, whether there will be any gains for private actors and what those gains might be. Obviously, a basic research is one such domain of uncertainty, and therefore government funding is essential. And the book does comment very briefly on the role of basic research in the Moonshot. But when I looked at the mission maps, I really couldn't see where basic research figured at all. And yet this is the riskiest part of it all. By the time that DARPA or some DARPA-like agency comes into the picture, most of the riskiest part of the activity has already been done, and the problems are ones of execution. Consider the development of the COVID vaccines. We've all rightly cheered the fantastic job that Operation Warp Speed did between April and November 2020 in bringing the vaccines from a laboratory project into the arms of Americans. It seems the perfect example of a moonshot where there was tremendous public resolve, cooperation between silos in government and between government and industry. But I think we need to step back for a moment and see where all this came from basic genomic research, which was largely funded by the government, from the 2005 research in the University of Pennsylvania laboratories on how to encase the mRNA in lipids, from 2010, when DARPA became interested in vaccines because US soldiers are all over the world and hence vulnerable to all sorts of diseases. And that led DARPA to identify mRNA technologies as promising and to support their development. Then DARPA funds Moderna in 2013. But without basic genomics research, and specifically without the research carried out at the University of Pennsylvania laboratories, none of this would have been possible. And without the catastrophic pandemic, there never would have been the kind of public resolve that we saw. So what about other big societal challenges? Take, for example, renewable energy. David Hart and Richard Lester actually have considered whether it could be approached as a moonshot. And they point out that with the Manhattan Project and the Apollo Project, there was a single, unambiguous, high-risk technical goal, a bomb that would work in the first case, a trip to the moon and back in the latter. There was only one customer, the federal government, and the solution only had to work a few times. Cost was no object. The government was committed to doing the job, whatever it took. And with energy innovation, it's entirely different. There are multiple and some conflicting goals. There are different users. Cost matters a lot. And there's a big group in society, and not just lobbyists, who actively oppose renewable energy and getting out of fossil fuels. So thinking about these three cases, Apollo moonshot, COVID vaccine, and energy, I've come up with two questions for Mariana. Question one, on the Apollo moon landing, there might have been people who thought we should do something else, but with the money. But there was no group in society that actually opposed landing on the moon. Today, for about every big societal project I can think of, there are people passionately opposed to the project. So in your book, you talk about bringing citizens into the process of agreeing on missions. But can we actually get people to agree? And related to this, and this is my second question, considering how hard it is to get people to agree, particularly in this time of partisan polarization, if you had to choose one big project that you think could work like a moonshot, what would it be?
There we go. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Really, really incredibly interesting comments. So, I mean, just to kind of backtrack a bit before I get to your two questions, just in terms of what you said, the reason I didn't talk too much about R&D in this book, going back to Anna's question, is because I talked about it a lot in the entrepreneurial state, which, there the point was actually, it's not just that the public sector put in most of the money in terms of all those general purpose technologies, it put it in early stage, in the high risk stage, in the capital intensive stage. And that kind of risk was actually about uncertainty. Think of what Frank Knight and Keynes talked about in terms of distinguishing risk from uncertainty. That was true uncertainty, right? For every success, there's many failures, and many of the discoveries that are often made with innovation also happen from, again, trial and error. And for every success, there's at least 10 failures. And, it's not a probability kind of lottery that you can actually model with kind of a proper risk model. So this is true uncertainty when we look at innovation, and the fact that the state has, whether we look at health innovation, energy innovation, internet, nanotech, biotech, space, actually put in that early stage high risk finance and kind of not getting the credit, so that the word entrepreneurship and entrepreneurialism is only seen as a kind of private sector word, when actually if you think of entrepreneurship as taking on risk, then hence the need for this kind of new narrative and storytelling around the entrepreneurial state. And DARPA, which you mentioned a couple times, what was so interesting was actually it had an intra-organizational culture that was explicitly about welcoming risk-taking. I organized a conference back in 2014 with what I called back then mission-oriented finance institutions, and asked people, like the head at the time of ARPA-E, so the equivalent of DARPA, but in the DOE, much smaller budget. Her name was Cheryl Martin. How do they do stuff given that, there's a lot of failure? How do they measure success? What is the kind of HR policy that's required within the civil service in order to welcome that kind of risk taking? And she said that they actually measured success by how much risk, a staff were willing to take, but also how much economy-wide impact the successes have, right? So not just tinkering on the sidelines. Anyway, that's all. I kind of felt that I had said that already. So what this book tried to do is actually focus more on your two questions, right? Which is, if we saw with the Apollo program, this immense amount of risk taking, to the point, as you said, they had no idea how to get to the moon in the early 60s when Kennedy gave his, famous speeches of, we're going to do it because it's hard, not because it's easy. If you look at kind of what they knew in the conversations, they were like, all right, God, now we got to do it. And there was like 3 or 4 completely different ways they thought they would kind of organize it. And they ended up landing on the lunar orbit rendezvous way, but that willingness to experiment and also to, massively fail. So you'll remember the Apollo 1 fire when those 3 astronauts died on January 27th, 1967. What was interesting with that was they learned from that failure. They invested within their own organization to do the learning by doing. It's not enough to say failure, risk-taking. What does it mean to invest within your organization to learn from those failures? And they had George Mueller, who then came in on the back of the Apollo 1 fire to reorganize NASA itself to work outside of its usual silos. Because Gus Grissom, one of the astronauts who died, famously said just before dying, basically an hour before, he said, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Reflecting on NASA's kind of, again, siloed, very top down, not horizontal, not agile, not flexible ways of thinking and organizing, which then changed. Anyway, so, so all those lessons that I've just mentioned, I think are equally important for climate. Like we need public institutions that do things because they're hard, not because they're easy, that welcome experimentation, that invest within their institutions, as opposed to outsourcing capacity to consulting companies like McKinsey and so on. We might get back to that later, but I think that's a massive problem. What is not replicable is exactly what you talked about, right? That there's, it's not a technocratic solution that is going to get us, the kind of, to fight global warming or the digital divide, or even to get the plastic out of the ocean, which would be one amazing mission underneath the SDG around life underwater, because these all require regulatory change, political change, social change, behavioral change. And it's not just about, the whole cost dynamic that you talked about is very different. So, but you reflected on the issue of citizens. And I think, this is probably the part of the book, but also my own work that I need to be listening to others more, because as an economist, I don't think this is something we know how to do. Let me just give you an example. We're in my institute setting up a whole new master's in public administration for global bureaucrats, which is alternative to public choice theory, new public management, which has convinced civil servants that not only at best they can fix markets, but guess what? Government failure is even worse than market failure. So take up as little space as possible and then get out of the way. So what does it mean actually to have that kind of co-creation of markets, co-shaping, not market fixing? The first thing surely has to be interacting with others and listening to others through democratic fora, which requires a level of empathy, which is not in the curriculum for civil servants, right? So for example, in the work that we're doing in Camden around the mission-oriented approach, Camden, sorry, is a part of London where I live. We have these 4 different missions, which are very local. The carbon neutral, sustainability agenda, we're focusing it on local housing estates. Okay, so actually using housing estates as the fora through which you then galvanize kind of a carbon neutral agenda within Camden. And the first thing is, of course, to bring citizens, housing residents, so residents in the housing associations, to the table to even talk about what does it mean to have a sustainability agenda. So you're not just feeding in this top-down way, telling everyone it's going to be good for you, just kind of follow, what we tell you. And that bit is where it gets really messy because people don't always agree. When we had citizen assemblies with Brexit, that was messy, but it was actually quite inspirational. It was the only inspirational thing around Brexit, to be honest. I mean, we don't have to talk about Brexit. We will get depressed if we do that. So I think there's something about these societal challenges, these wicked problems, that are both much more amenable to citizen engagement, but it's also dangerous. You open huge cans of worms and you have to be willing to listen. And by the way, empathy and sympathy are not the same thing. Empathy literally is putting yourself in other people's shoes. Sympathy is just like, oh, I get it. I'm so sorry for you, right? So
Mariana, you have one more minute. And I think,
God, yeah.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
just to say,
yeah.
I think what you've talked, in the book, I kind of, do it quite quickly, which is to say that societal challenges, unlike purely technological ones, need citizen engagement. But the how to do that, I think, often require new types of democratic fora or reviving ones around the cooperative movement, the mutual movement, the, again, citizen assembly movement, which some countries have, again, the UK has relived it recently, which itself should be seen as part of the innovation we require. It's more of a social innovation. But then that does mean, being willing to carry through with it. So for example, what does it mean to allow citizens also to be part of the accountability, part of the metrics to make sure that missions are not going off course? Because the biggest danger with missions is that just because you begin one, you then stick with it because it was someone's pet project, right? So if you have metrics along the way, you have both long-termism, but metrics along the way that teach you when to turn the tap off, because you'll know that DARPA, one of its secret successes is also turning the tap off, not just keeping it on forever. Who decides that? How can we, for example, in Sweden, they have a mission around school food to make sure that school food is tasty, sustainable, and healthy. And they've brought kids in the process of making sure that along the way, they're not going away from their mission of also making sure it's tasty. So it's not just IKEA meatballs. And I know this sounds a bit facetious, but it's not, which is how do you both get the co-creation in the beginning to have different voices, but also along the way have opportunities for that accountability to be coming from those who, in theory, you're doing these policies for.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mariana. It's an interesting exchange between a political scientist and an economist. We have another political scientist up, Antonio Botelho, who is going to speak next. You're on, Antonio. But you're still muted. Antonio, you need to unmute there.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, SASE, for the invitation. Thank Anna for the introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here among old friends and colleagues from MIT and elsewhere. And also a great pleasure to be able to comment on Mazzucato's book. I think my comments are going to be a bit more somber now, coming from a state like Brazil, which is one of the states, one of the failed states in the current COVID crisis, where we about surpass, a number of deaths the US, which a much larger population there, and also not a very good experience in the state performing, these major missions, that have been celebrated in Mariana Mazzucato's book. So certainly, Mazzucato's book is a very instigating work, and what I try to place a state inspirational category, in this very ambitious volume, as also others have already said, as he puts, it's meant especially as a guide to how we can do capitalism different. It argues that we should change organizations, governance structures, and the design of practical levers of economic policies, the tools you need to build a purpose-oriented economy. So it has a lot of ambition to it, and it's well delivered. In contemporary times, in the realm of emerging countries where I come from, like Brazil, there's been, of course, a long and celebrated lineage of work in the vein of the state aiming to shape capitalism in the form of the developmental state. From Evans in 1995 edited volume on the bringing the state back in, to Evans 1995 embedded autonomy, to Hagar's 1918 developmental state, among many others like Alice Andes, Atul Kohli, etc. And all of them generally advancing the idea of the state as a midwife, as Evans put it. The states foster interest by assisting in the emergence of new social groups and interests. So already back in 1995, Evans concluded for his analysis of recognizably complex cases, which he studied in that book, with multiple uncertain structural feedbacks and intended consequences that transform both state and society. And he concluded that uniformly treating bureaucrats align fodder is a mistake. Disdain is often deserved, but state bureaucracy can also be homes to creative entrepreneurial initiatives. In a way echoes some of the recent books by Mazzucato. Used imaginatively, they can spark a new source of social energy, fewer predators, and more midwives should be the goal. So in a way, I think Evans' conclusions and sort of the method in that book, either echoes from what Mazzucato has brought to us today. The mission economy in this sense, following this lineage with a renewed assurance, and oddly enough, harkening back to the 60s, to find lessons and inspirations for modeling the mission and the purpose of the modern state to transform capitalism. Of course, the diagnostic is that capitalism is in crisis or stuck, or that the state, under the weight of the criticisms they have received over the past decades, has retained its transformative capacity, which now needs to be recovered to face the new global challenges now. And I quote, "But because government activity, direct investments, and direct subsidies, tax, and regulations lies at the center of nearly all relationships, rethinking government means rethinking capitalism," which is certainly a very tall order now, especially when you think about states like Brazil. Currently, despite the capitalism our controlling competence in critique, but a very competent one that she gave us, rather than having a sustainable growth path, I quote, "Capitalism has built economies that inflate speculative bubbles, enrich the already immensely wealth to 1%, and we're destroying the planet now." The normative template that the Mazzucato brings us in the playbook for changes in the state put forth in the book seems to come out straight out of the entrepreneurial capitalist model, from mission-oriented to risk and uncertain to milestone to continued experimentation. So I find it a little odd, that you kind of hark back to the past, when looking at the American state in its heyday in the 60s, but in the end, the template in the playbook, comes from the venture capitalist and entrepreneurial companies of the 90s and the 80s. Although the debunk the myth pursued in chapter 2 of the book is that myth 3 government needs to run like a business in later states, but if the government acts more like a venture capitalist and it structures and invests as a portfolio, then its risk reduced, So I don't know, I'd like to, Mariana, at some point, to try to enlighten me on this somewhat contradiction in terms of debunking the role of business, but at the same time copying the business as a model for the state. I'll just next focus on a few points about the book. On debunking the myth 1, business create value and take risks. Governments only de-risk and facilitate. The author does a good job of cherry picking elsewhere in the book, notably in the well-crafted presentation of the Apollo mission and listing its spillovers to make it this argument. However, there's still considerable debate in the specialized literature about the relevance of programs that she cites, like this beer, in relation to venture capital investment now. So what are the pros and cons of this beer and whether this beer work or not, for example, the work by Josh Lerner. Similar, some criticism is existing institutional paradigms for government actions like the CBA are thrown in rather lightly, when she talks about the UK governments having experience in reliably estimating the cost of offshore wind generated electricity as little as 6 months in advance, let alone the 25 years would be typical planning horizon for energy venture of this sort, similarly contradicting the repeated calls for government to take risks and face uncertainties and learn from trial and error experiences. Next, regarding myth 5, government shouldn't pick winners. Mazzucato raised the old problem of government capture by special interests in a way Suzanne Berger addressed it already. The real problem is when losers pick the government now. the issue of the capture, to argue that Mazzucato does. In fact, during periods of technological shifts, governments can play a critical role in coordinating industrial efforts and setting standards to create markets, but they must make decisions to pick a strategy and tilt the playing field in that direction. Finally, just to briefly mention that regarding to the Apollo mission point that they gave purpose and mobilized society, and I just want to call attention to a recent book review in the New York Times about a new book, Mercury Rising, John Kennedy and the New Battleground of the Cold War, what the author of the review calls that the book details Kennedy's persistent misgiving about the cost of space exploration and his skepticism about the tangible benefits it would bring. So there was a lot of uncertainty there. And goes on to say, in the end, Sheshel, the author of the book, argues Kennedy embraced a dramatically expanded space program, not out of genuine conviction of its value so much as a desire to boast national prestige, and concludes Sheshel's stories, raising escapable questions about whether space exploration is quite what its enthusiasts have often claimed. In the end, we find from this book and other related recent scholarship that the solution to wicked problems I'm currently working on, involving a big one in Brazil about education finance, such as the one portrayed here, as fit for a mission economy strategy, demands leadership to provide vision and purpose. Mazzucato's guidelines and normative analytic results make significant thoughtful contributions to the effort design and implementing a strategic blueprint for a mission economy, but beyond getting the prices or the institutions right and getting the right leader may come down to the luck of the draw. Unfortunately for us in Brazil, we have lost on that look of the draw and you have a terrible leader. So these are my comments in relation to those. I have two questions for Mariana now. One is, of course, it is a color by my experience in Brazil and my studies of capitalism in Brazil. What would be the incentives for capitalist firms to embrace the mission economy? If you could detail that, especially thinking in the context of more emerging economies, which I know that you've been to Brazil and you've worked with colleagues here. And the second broader question is how can the state and emerging countries still facing development advancement out of the middle income trap and welfare state construction challenges, and plagued by systemic and corruption and volatile politics, can aim for a mission economy? What are the, in your view, what would be some of the problems, the additional problems that emerging countries will have to develop a mission economy? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mariana.
Thank you, Antonio. Really good set of questions. I'm so glad this is being recorded because I'm going to go back and listen to these more later because the comments are just as interesting, obviously, as the questions, and they feed back into the comments. So just, again, really quickly, if I can just say something in terms of what you said about risk. So it's not that the state should emulate the risk-taking in the portfolio and act as a kind of a public venture capitalist. The point is the state does do that when it's successful. Those examples that Suzanne gave us, with the vaccine, that was government as risk taker. For every vaccine, trial that succeeded, there was many failures. So that level of risk taking is simply something that we don't talk about. What does it mean, though, to structure it like a portfolio? So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. That kind of brings us to the picking winners problem, right? Instead of saying, what are the top sectors, top technologies, top types of firms, whether it's SMEs or others that we're going to invest in, having that kind of portfolio perspective to choose a direction, not to level the playing field. That's one of the words I always cross off. You're going to tilt the playing field if we care about green transitions, but have a portfolio that you kind of are spreading also your risk across different types of areas. Thinking about it not as just one big project, HS2, if anyone is listening is in the UK, but different types of projects, and the tools themselves, the procurement grants and loans, are supposed to kind of catalyze, crowd in as many different types of solutions as possible to fulfill a goal. That itself requires a portfolio kind of analysis. But the other bit is, how do we then make sure we're socializing not just the risks in that process, but also the rewards? And since that's not your question, I'm not going to go into it, but that's what I mean by venture capitalists. And it's not about copying the US venture capital model, which, by the way, has been a failure. It's actually screwed over massively certain industries like biotechnology, and different people have written about this, but that kind of exit-driven venture capital model where VCs want to exit in 3 to 5 years through a buyout or an IPO created many productless IPOs, PLIPOs in the biotech sector. And it's hardly, I would say, a successful model in terms of science-based industries. And actually what VC has done in the US is often kind of free-rided on top of other types of long-term public finance, like the SBIR funding, the VCs have actually, if you read Fred Block's book, The State of Innovation, used the SBIR funding as a filter, as a way to know even which companies to invest in, because they know they've received that early stage high risk funding from the state. Anyway, so in terms of your questions on emerging economies, as you've mentioned, I've worked both with Brazil, but more recently in South Africa. And I think the questions you raise are incredibly pertinent, both in terms of what happens when you have a weak state. And by the way, I'm from Italy, as you might know, and the mafia in Italy, which is known all over the world because of Hollywood, but the mafia is really interesting. It actually came about because of a weak state. The south of Italy had a much weaker state than the north, and the mafia in some ways was a solution to that, right? So corruption often kind of thrives on weak states, and they set up in the south this Società dei Beati Paoli. It was like a mutual help organization precisely to kind of fill that gap of a weak state. So and Italy, we also have our own kind of levels of corruption and so on. You don't have to go to developing countries to kind of see those problems. And of course, the crony capitalism that we've seen revealed in the UK government recently with COVID-19. Again, many of the problems you're raising are actually, widely problematic. So, but in terms of emerging economies, in terms of both the incentives of why to take it on, but also what is the actual relevance given the actual structure on the ground, I think there's two issues I'd raise. First is this issue of weak states. I think what really is required is to ask ourselves, what does it then mean to tackle that kind of issue around the dynamic capabilities within the public sector, which weak states often have? One might argue that that's a luxurious topic when actually underneath, is a lot of corruption and the lack of infrastructure. We just need to kind of fund some basic stuff in order for an economy to function and not worry about these luxurious issues like dynamic capabilities of public institutions. And I would say, far from it. If we don't actually tackle that issue of what are the capabilities, the capacities, the changes to procurement, the changes to the way we actually even think of the training itself of bureaucrats in developing countries, it's going to be very hard actually to see change. And the fact that in those countries, there is an over-reliance on other types of institutions, whether it's consulting companies, philanthropies, or World Bank type gap fillers, I think has also increased the problem. And, secondly, at that level, instead of just kind of talking about it philosophically, what does it mean to really get our hands dirty to make sure that entities like, for example, development banks in Brazil, BNDES, what does it mean actually to make sure that these very institutions become part of the solution and not part of the problem, or state-owned enterprises? And one thing I learned in Brazil that was so interesting is that when there is a mission, or I would actually argue vision, right? At least with the early Lula government, but also in some ways the second Lula government, there was a real vision, I think, to tackle both kind of the inclusive growth and the innovation-led growth kind of challenged together. And what I saw is that kind of leadership then did come down into the design of the bank itself, BNDES. So for example, at the time, there was a desire to help the generic companies in Brazil producing generic drugs not just be bought up by a lot of international multinational companies, which by the way would keep the Brazilian name of the company to make it look like a diverse ecosystem, but they were all getting bought up. And what BNDES did at the time, because there was pressure on it to deliver actually on some sort of public purpose goals and not just hand out money to whatever sector required it, is they created conditionality to make sure that the generic producers were doing something kind of good, right? So instead of producing drugs that required people to take 5 pills a day, which you will forget, especially if you live in a favela where your life is quite disruptive, the idea was, creating conditionality of produce a drug that you take 1 time a day. And I know it sounds a bit perhaps simplistic and frivolous, but that kind of conditionality to make sure that you're not just giving a subsidy or a guarantee, but there's a focus on what is the ultimate outcome is what's required. And even coming back to Suzanne's point before about the vaccine, it's not enough to say that the government funded, by the way, I look at the numbers in the book of all the government funding for the vaccines, at least at the time of the writing. You also then need to govern that process for the public interest. So in the US, it's ridiculous that you have 40 billion a year going in by the NIH, and then somehow the prices don't reflect that public contribution, and the intellectual property rights are allowed to be abused. And IPR, of course, is a contract between public and private. And so in developing countries, also where you have state-owned enterprises, you could also think of the conditionality, not just in terms of public-private, but public-public. how can you make ESCOM in South Africa, again, part of the solution and not part of the problem? And as we all know, ESCOM has been, to a large extent, part of the problem in South Africa. So conditionality in terms of the relationship between a Ministry of Finance, a Treasury, and its state-owned enterprise in terms of creating conditions to really kind of build back better, not just in terms of COVID, but conditions attached to the funding of a state-owned enterprise.
Thank you, Mariana. Yeah, I think.
Super last thing, natural resource countries like Chile and others in Latin America that, or everywhere, that are based on natural resources. It's interesting, again, to use a mission approach where the key thing is to have an intersectoral collaboration towards a particular mission. So to look at, for example, copper in Chile, not as a sector that needs to be funded or helped from a bank, but as an input to a problem that has to be solved. So around solar and renewable energy, as you know, copper has an important role. And that requires a different mindset from looking at a sector as just a natural resource sector to help to the transformation that's required in that sector, and also the collaboration between sectors in order to fulfill a mission.
Great, thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mariana. Okay, Michael Storper, you are next.
Well, it's an honor to participate in this panel, and I want to start out by saying that I found obviously the book to be extremely stimulating, and the critique of the role of government obviously to be a kind of real cutting edge advance, and the critique of what Suzanne mentioned, beyond market failure kind of framework, and to push us and to think about how we can shape market societies and technology. So I think this is an extremely important critique and comes obviously at a critical time. So what I want to talk about is the use of the Apollo mission as the kind of central axis of the book's reasoning. The argument seems to be that we could use mission-oriented frameworks like the Apollo mission to affect the roads taken and not taken, sort of create different what ifs for such things as major technological changes, and even beyond that, what Mariana Mazzucato calls the wicked problems that face us today. Now, and I think I'm going to echo a little bit of what Suzanne was starting to get at in her comments, is I see the Apollo mission as a top-down, single goal, bureaucratically internalized and centrally financed mission. A complex one and an ambitious one, but still one in which there was essentially one order giver and one client for this major technological and societal effort. And I think there are analogous missions we could think about. For example, the highly successful programs that we've had in France for building high-speed trains, the TGV system, or nuclearization of our electricity grid, or even at a European level, the creation of Airbus. These are all big, successful missions that in many ways have the same structure as what was done in Apollo. Now, the book tells us over and over again that these technological missions are not the same as wicked social, environmental, societal mission moonshots. But it still returns again and again to the Apollo model, which is a top-down technological systems kind of mission. So that's actually where I got, to be honest, a bit hung up in reading the book, because I couldn't really see how the Apollo model was the right example for this other kind of wicked problem. So that I had a bit of a cognitive dissonance problem, to be honest. Now, if we stick to large examples of large-scale technological innovation, in that sense, I think the book goes against the grain of a lot of the thinking that we've evolved about the third industrial revolution, at least in comparison to, say, the second industrial revolution, in other words, the manufacturing era versus the post-1970s IT era. We characterize historians characterize innovation in the second industrial revolution as having a role for, very big role for large firms, but of course government doing basic research, but large firms that internalized a lot of the mission-oriented research for many of the manufacturing from innovations. But we then study the third industrial revolution, and what I think most scholars discover is that though there was certainly a role for DARPA, the Defense Department, large-scale government funding in the beginning, that ultimately it created a new kind of open innovation system, what we would today call the networked ecology of innovation and so on, and that it was really a major break with how innovation occurred up to about the mid-20th century in the second industrial revolution. In my own research, when I recently compared two major regional economies in the US, meaning Southern California and Northern California, part of the story that we told was that in Southern California, which was a great top-down innovation economy with big-time clients and big-time firms, it failed to make it big in the third industrial revolution because it didn't transition organizationally the way the San Francisco Bay Area did. And at a larger scale, another example that I would provide here is the US compared to Europe in the third industrial revolution. Here in Europe, we continued our mission-oriented way of trying to push technological change. I could cite the case of France. We had 3 top-down plans to try and make it into the information technology age, Plan Calcul 1, 2, and 3, and we didn't make it. Or we look at, you can generalize that to see the failure of European powers to establish any commanding positions in the third industrial revolution compared to the US. And I think that's actually because in the US, the system that evolved mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area did not stick to the Apollo mission model, whereas many European governments did. And there was and still is a terrible kind of incumbency and legacy problem in the corporate and research structures that dominate in Europe. The EU and the EU taking over there, its various attempts at innovation policy, some of which I've been involved in, and which are cited approvingly in the book, frankly, are not very encouraging examples of mission orientation. We've kind of locked ourselves into second mover land, and that to me isn't very satisfying. And so really just to kind of return to this kind of major issue for me is the Apollo mission model is, for me, not really a very good one. And if we then loop around to this other point of, if we go beyond technological innovation to the wicked kind of problems that you're calling our attention to, and absolutely rightly so, I'm wondering how the mission-oriented or moonshot model that you advance here really could help us with those kinds of wicked problems. And so again, I want to reiterate that I enthusiastically share the critique the book is making of the failures of contemporary capitalism, but I remain a little bit sort of, wanting to know more about how we could address both technological questions, but also more broadly, these wicked problems that you speak about in many of the chapters.
Thanks, Michael. And your question kind of reminds me that maybe we need to define some terms, because what I tried to do in the book, and if I could rewrite it, I would use a highlighter instead of just repeating it many times. I would just make sure it was in bigger writing, which is to say, let's not confuse big projects like the Concorde, HS2, whatever it might be, with what I'm talking about, which is a mission-oriented approach in the way that I define it in the book, which is different from just talking about the Apollo mission. In fact, I start with the Apollo mission and then abandon it. In some ways, the Apollo mission is mainly interesting to me because of the organizational change that it required. NASA even cared about, they really cared about how to work with the private sector in a way that was truly what I would call about collectively kind of, co-creating. So they even had a no excess profits clause. I repeat, no excess profits. In other words, if we're gonna do this together, NASA, Honeywell, Motorola, General Electric, let's not make this into a gambling casino, which is what I think we have in the healthcare sector today. it's a gambling casino, and I can tell you more. The amount of share buybacks that Pfizer has engaged in, Exxon as well, in the last 10 years is incredible. So $4 trillion in just buying back one's own shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay by some very large companies, including in the health sector, with no conditions attached to what should be done with profits, which are in fact an outcome of that collective creation in the healthcare sector. So NASA cared to do that. It cared to design procurement in such a way that wasn't just cost plus, but fixed price, almost like a prize scheme. So really clear on the outcome, but very open on the how, not micromanaging at all. Had they micromanaged, they wouldn't have had these amazing spillovers that occurred along the way from camera phones, athletic shoes, home insulation, foil blankets, scratch resistant lenses, and so on. These are all some ways outcomes of leaving the process quite open. And that itself, I think, is very important. You don't want to, again, put all your eggs in one basket and micromanage the process that can kill innovation. They also warned against constantly, there's this guy, Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement, who said, if we don't ourselves invest in our own knowledge creation kind of machine, our brain, we're going to get captured. We're going to get captured by what he called brochuremanship. So they didn't have PowerPoints at the time in the private sector. They had these cute little brochures. They'd come in and say, we can help you. And he said, we won't even know which private sector company to work with. We won't know how to write the terms of reference with the private sector. And I just think that is massively what we have today. Many public entities working with the private sector, not knowing how to write the terms of reference, not knowing who to work with, not having processes that are, again, outcomes driven, but open on the how. So why it's, I'm sorry, I'm not doing any PowerPoint, but I have these posters because I use these when I talk to policymakers. Where it's similar also in terms of the policy design is, had NASA just stopped at the space race, at Sputnik, it would have just been left here, right? It would have been at that challenge level. So when I say that we should begin with the SDGs, which yes, are more wicked, those are challenges, those aren't missions, right? So had NASA just said, clean up the oceans, fight global warming, it would have stopped there. The Apollo program was this, a plastic-free ocean, reduction of 90% of plastics entering the marine environment, and collection of more than half of plastics present in our oceans, seas, and coastal areas by a concrete date, 2025. You can actually answer yes or no. Did you achieve this? You can't answer that. I mean, you can say we don't have clean oceans, but having a targeted goal. Third, in terms of where the Apollo program is relevant, many different sectors. The Apollo program was not just aerospace. It required innovation in nutrition, in electronics, in materials, in software. The whole software industry in some way could be seen as a spillover of that process, right? So not having this random top-down sector-based approach, which so many countries, now that industrial strategy is sexy again, after being a blasphemy for many years, industrial strategy is too often just a list of top sectors. They're often called top sectors or key sectors. In the UK, up until recently, they were aerospace, automobiles, financial services, creative industries, and life sciences. To do what? Just to get a bunch of subsidies, guarantees, and have access to public investment? Right? So all sectors in an economy, and obviously depending which economy we're talking about, can be part of a mission, right? So missions designed in such a way that are ambitious or inspirational or addressing a challenge, but are intersectoral, that's key. And that is actually, again, you can use the Apollo program to see just how many sectors were involved, how many businesses were involved, but with a guided, a program that was in fact very specific on the outcome, open on the how, but you could actually answer yes or no, did they get to the moon? And lastly, being as much catalytic as possible of the bottom-up projects. Sorry, you probably can't read this, but examples for the Clean Oceans one, reusable and biodegradable plastic substitutes, plastic and microplastic digestion mechanisms, reuse of packing items through personalized collection services. There will be so many different projects, 500 of which, for every successful one, there will be different failures. So to redesign those tools, procurement, grants, loans, or in the COVID recovery scheme, bailouts and recovery funds, not just to give out money to random lists of sectors, technologies, or firms, but to catalyze as much experimentation bottom up to fulfill a goal. That is hardly what we have in France. That is hardly what we have in Italy. The reason I try to help Europe change its approach is because I too think it has failed. They talk about challenges at this really broad level. For 20 years now, plastered all over Brussels are 3 words: smart, inclusive, sustainable growth. Really? I don't see that anywhere. And so that's like really blah, blah, blah at that high level. So the idea was, okay, it's great we're interested in those words. It's also great every country has signed up to the SDGs. What would it look like to start actually getting concrete on really ambitious goals that many different sectors, not projects, is what you talked about, and this is sort of my reaction. I feel like in how you talked about it, you were confusing or not confusing, how do you say? There's the potential confusion of a project, a big project in the desert with the mission itself, which requires lots of different projects and not putting all your eggs in a basket and getting all your different sectors to invest and innovate towards that. How do you do that? Not by command and control, telling everyone what they have to do, but again, coming back to that issue of conditionality. 40 billion a year, I come back to the, Suzanne's point, from the NIH going into health innovation with no conditions attached on the IPR, on the prices, or even on the direction, but again, you don't want to micromanage that too much because that will stifle innovation. If you look at digital platforms today, we call these big tech companies, but most of the tech was government financed. In many cases, they're media companies, but we're not regulating them as media, but also that same technology, the digital platforms, if with all that public investment that went into the internet, GPS, and so forth, and then we just assume that somehow the benefits to citizens would just happen from the knowledge spillovers without governing it through a mission-oriented lens. And sometimes that needs new institutions. In Barcelona, the city, well, you all know it's a city in Spain, the mayor Ada Colau actually brought in hackers into the city team in order to govern data creation and governance for the public purpose to improve public transport and public housing. They didn't have the civil servants to do that, or the data trust and the data commons kind of notion. So they created that in order to have that kind of more governance for the public interest. And that itself, by the way, in Spain has been interesting in terms of that kind of citizen engagement. So the Decode project of the city, which tried to foster that less intermediated interaction between data creation and the kind of improvements to the welfare state, actually has had a lot of citizen involvement. And so I think that's sort of my answer is like, some of the lessons in terms of organizational change, designing procurement for, a goal-oriented policy, keeping open the how, having a culture of risk-taking, but also really paying attention to the symbiosis and not parasitism that we see in space today, where you have Elon Musk making billions on the back of a huge public infrastructure and then creating all this debris in space so the scientists can't see anything. That's hardly kind of, what we're talking about. So it's not just about, public money going in and thinking about big projects. It is very much about what are we actually trying to achieve, catalyzing as many different actors to be part of the process, but then getting your hands dirty in the design of the tools on the ground to make sure that it truly is purpose and mission oriented. And what I try to do in the book, and perhaps I should have done more, is to list all the failures, why this doesn't happen when you don't have that kind of public purpose lens. Thank you very much. Great exchange. Last but certainly not least, Nick Ziegler is up. Let me just, before we go, for you that are in the audience, we are welcoming questions in the Q&A space at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if we don't get questions from you, I'm sure the panelists and I can come up with other questions for Mariana to speak to. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Anna, and thanks to the organizers for including me in this really fascinating panel. It's a terrific pleasure to be here with mentors, friends, colleagues from whom I've learned so much over the years. And thanks also to Mariana Mazzucato for writing this important and within the context of the economics discipline, really very courageous book. In the interest of time, I'd like to abbreviate my comments, which not surprisingly would repeat many of the remarks that other panelists have made, and follow up on some of the questions that have already been raised. Like Michael, I found the Apollo project a very interesting way of framing a critique of economic thinking about the role of the state, and also found the book extraordinarily stimulating because, as Suzanne and really everybody on the panel has said, it gives us and argues very insistently for a new way of thinking about the role of government. But like other speakers, I also found myself thinking about the tension between the focal goals of the mission-oriented approach and all of the correlates that Mariana describes and analyzes with great nuance in the book for changed approaches as capitalism itself changes. And of course, the state as an institution varies across countries and changes over time as well. But there's a long list of really critical aspects of adapting the mission-oriented approach that she advocates, new forms of public-private partnerships so that both sides can build internal capabilities, limiting this tendency from public choice theory toward outsourcing, which I found fascinating. The number of architects, for example, employed in the public service in Britain has changed from almost half of the profession to less than 10% of the profession today. That's just one very vivid example of how much the state has itself in Great Britain undermined and hollowed out its own capabilities. And there are a long list of equally important ways in which this book shows us that the mission-oriented approach can be broadened and adapted. I did end up, however, with much the same question that Michael had, whether the tension between democratic deliberation and decision-making to choose a public purpose, whether that tension with the top-down design of state policy is so severe that maybe we should ask whether the mission-oriented lens is the best or the only or the primary starting point for the transformations that the book calls for, or should we try to think not in terms of missions, but in terms of public purposes, open-ended public purposes to be realized through a more decentralized kind of approach? And just a few quick examples before I put the question on the table for Mariana. In the United States, agricultural extension, in a way, which has existed since the 1860s and the beginning of land-grant universities, designed precisely to accomplish what we would now call translational research, and to do it in a way that helped farmers initially and still does in a remarkable number of localities today. More current examples would be the manufacturing extension project, some of which seems to be getting built into this very recent innovation and competition bill, which is virtually the only thing that has gotten through the polarized Senate under the Biden administration. And that's a very interesting example that we might want to think about. Other examples come from especially German technology policy, which has for decades given us a very strong contrast to the more mission-oriented approaches of the French dirigie style of policymaking. And that contrast, of course, has evolved over time. It's nowhere near as simple today as it was several years ago. But let me wrap up simply by asking two questions. Has the nature and the contours of our technology reservoir now become so much more transnational and complex that the idea of a mission-oriented lens where we can design organizational structures may no longer work? We need to stimulate organizational monitors and technology brokering institutions, but very much at the regional, that is subnational, regional, and municipal level. in order to use technology and shape it so that it does do what the book is so powerfully calling for, to satisfy human needs. And the second related question is, might a more decentralized approach not also help us more easily accomplish the preconditions for consensus around these public purposes, which are so much at the heart of the mission-oriented approach that you're calling for? So those two questions. And thanks again to Mariana for confronting us with this really fabulously interesting book.
So thank you so much, Nick. Am I on mute? No, good. All of you, God. I mean, I feel so grateful because they're all both, you know, put very politely and nicely, but also with you know, perfectly going to the knot, to the problems in the argument, but also in what we have problems if we actually care about designing policy in a better way. So super useful. And I love what you said, Nick, about, because in fact, I guess that's what I tried to argue for. And that's what I meant by, if I rewrote the book, maybe I'd focus less on the word mission and moonshot that can so easily get misunderstood. But I was trying to use it, or how do you say, not capture it, what's the word when you try to reclaim the word in a way that would not be technocratic, because actually people can think of the Apollo program and can think about, first of all, that it happened 50 years ago. They just celebrated the 50th anniversary, or now it's 51. And so it's in people's minds. It did inspire. And so you don't have to actually explain the history. The history is out there. And yet there's so little understanding of how much designed thinking, if we can use that trendy word that's used today, that was required by NASA in order to make it happen. It wasn't just helicopter money in the aeronautics industry and then hope for the best, which is what I think we have in the health sector. It was designed, that kind of intersectoral and huge amounts of private initiative that was done, again, goal-oriented, but open on the how, that was designed into the process. And I think there's lots of learnings there. What you said, which is maybe we should talk more about open-ended kind of public purpose systems, is exactly what I think I tried to argue for. And I love how you said it. I mean, that's why I set up, by the way, an institute called the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I didn't call it the Institute for Missions or the Moonshot Institute. It's the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is both trying, sorry, this is at University College London, and the university. It's our own department. And why I'm kind of proud that it's a department is that we need to rewrite the curriculum. There's no actually public purpose curriculum for civil servants, because we've allowed the curriculum to be fed by, again, a public choice theory, new public management. And so both the curriculum, but also what we call practice-based theorizing. So these notions of public purpose, public value, mission-oriented design to public policies, it's much, much harder than just giving a TED talk about it. When you try to, for example, set up a mission-oriented public bank, which is what I helped Scotland do, to avoid having a public bank like the Italian one, which is literally just a handout machine to whichever sector or firm begs for money. What does it mean to have a development bank or a public bank, a state investment bank, which is providing patient, long-term committed finance towards public goals like the digital divide, and thinking about its lending policy, its portfolio, to crowd in as much activity as possible to actually solve a problem like eliminating the digital divide in Scotland, right? That requires a very different design thinking than, here's a public bank and it's going to help shitty companies remain viable in order to stand in place, which is what unfortunately you have in many different countries, which is just lending in order to stay in place, as opposed to that transformational change that we require. And so the issue, however, that you bring in on top of that is the issue of decentralization. And already in the entrepreneurial state, I talked about the entrepreneurial state as a decentralized network of different types of entrepreneurial state institutions. That's the first point, which is to say this isn't about one big public entity. It's about bringing a mission and an entrepreneurial state kind of approach to all public institutions. So the recent work I did with the BBC, for example, in the UK, was very much trying to understand, in the first instance, to be in listening mode, how the BBC has operated through this notion of public value and public purpose, which it talks about, it's designed into the system. Very different, by the way, from PBS in the US, which as good as PBS is, and when I used to live in the US, I grew up in the US, I'd listen to PBS News, but PBS is a classic market fixer. It produces high quality news, documentaries, and so on. It doesn't do what the BBC does, which is to delve into any area, including soap operas, talk shows, through this notion of public value, right? EastEnders, soap opera on the working class, as opposed to Dallas and Dynasty. You know, that whole thing required a notion of public value, pushing the market frontier, being successful at it. So they ended up crowding in private initiative, right? This is the irony that when you are mission oriented, when you do play that entrepreneurial state role, as I try to describe, you end up crowding in and benefiting the private sector because you've created a new space, new opportunities within which to play. But that requires having public value metrics. What does it mean to talk about public value? What's the accountability? Because you can't just say, we're going to do all the soap operas. What is a kind of public purpose driven way to do a soap opera? The Tate Modern is an organization, it's a large museum here in London we've started to work with in terms of rethinking the public museum through these kinds of metrics. So that's one point, which is it's not about one big public organization, but a decentralized network. But then you have the regional aspect that you're talking about in terms of decentralization. And here too, I think, I mean, and I'm sure you agree, and I know you're not saying it simplistically, but I don't think it's about centralization or decentralization. If we look at the COVID pandemic and just how, you know, the UK, by the way, Antonio, also has one of the highest death rates. Just because we're doing well with the vaccine, we're hiding the fact that we have one of the worst death rates across the world. But one of the things that we did terribly was, in fact, just outsourcing a lot of the capacity, for example, with test and trace to Deloitte, which the last time I checked, Deloitte does not specialize in test and trace. But with the vaccine, what was interesting was not only did it come out of a huge amount of kind of public investment and the way that Suzanne was talking about, but actually the vaccine rollout, which has been really successful, has been completely decentralized through a national health service, which, however, in the UK, as you'll know, is decentralized across general practitioner practices. So it's a decentralized network of community-based organizations with a lot of expertise. They're part of a system, but without that kind of trust that, you know, that the network of GP practices have at the community level, and the way that it was governed very much at the community level. And they were empowered to do so, unlike the test and trace system, which was purely centralized with very little competence because of who it was outsourced to. So there are kind of both those little tricky issues that we're dealing with at the same time. I think we need to learn from those experiences, right? So it's not about saying we should just decentralize everything or centralize, but how can we strengthen systems like a health system through a mission-oriented lens, but actually then govern it in a decentralized way, increasing the community-based, the local capacity, which is required in order to govern it properly. I think production capacity as well has been a huge lesson during COVID-19. So many countries, if you look at the world in terms of centralization and decentralization, had no capacity whatsoever to produce what was needed. And that's also been a big wake-up call in terms of having a decentralized capacity, so kind of a biodiversity in the system of what's produced and where. And what I found so interesting in Italy, where again, sorry if I keep coming back to Italy, but that is where I'm from, where procurement is usually done in a very parasitic way, just giving out a contract from the public to the private with no notion of kind of an ambitious goal, because the crisis was so bad. And you'll remember Italy was on the front lines. And because there was zero capacity locally to produce what was needed, personal protection equipment was all produced in China, all of it in Italy, 100% dependent on Chinese PPE. Italy, almost in a wartime mentality, was like, okay, we need to change that. And they ended up with 137 different companies in Italy, which now produce all of Italian PPE, very locally based through an industrial strategy, unlike Italy's normal industrial strategy, which is again, just giving out money to particular sectors. This was on a goal, which ended up fostering real local capacity in production structures to produce something that was required. Again, much more simplistic than some other types of, one could call it missions, but using an industrial strategy procurement to fulfill a goal, whether it's getting the plastic out of the ocean, digital divide, reducing knife crime in London. I mean, I live in London where, knife crime, I don't know if you've heard, Trump told the UK, the London mayor, oh, just give them guns. They'll stop knifing each other. They'll just shoot each other. But anyway, even something like zero knife crime amongst London teenagers, because these are 13 to 17-year-old boys literally killing each other every weekend. It's very much an outcome of extreme deprivation, which has been especially not only, but also really hurt by 10 years of austerity, where we cut mental health, youth centers, public libraries, you name it, it was cut. Even that could be surely a mission that could bring lots of different sectors together, seen through an industrial strategy and innovation policy lens, but it would have to be obviously local, right? It would make no sense to have a national strategy. It would have to make sense in the city and the neighborhoods. And that's where the citizen engagement again. Sorry.
Yeah, Mariana, thank you very much. I'm going to just throw in one question. We have a couple from the audience, but so there's a little bit, as I think Michael said, cognitive dissonance when you talk about public institutions, because you've told us convincingly that they've been hollowed out. You know, they're sending everything to the consultants, to McKinsey or whatever, and they've been defunded for decades. Our institutions at the local level and at the central level are pathetic. So I'm sort of imagining that we would have to have entirely new institutions in order to achieve what you're describing. How do we make it? It's a little bit, yeah, it's like we need to now get agreement among the public, but also transform our institutions. How do we reinvent government? We've tried so many times. I mean, maybe your new school can help us.
I mean, have we changed, again, the curriculum? I mean, I don't think so. Obama, by the way, Obama had this great quote. He said the last time that we really transformed government was at the age of black and white TV. So I think we don't stop complaining about government. We don't stop creating new ministries. Since I've lived in the UK, they've changed the name of the Ministry for Innovation 5 different times. So there's new policies, but not, sorry, go on.
I guess I'm interested in the transition. I accept your framing of what would be ideal. But if I think about the US institutions, which I know the best, they are, they're struggling without many resources. Many of the great people have left under Trump and prior administrations. There was an attempt called reinventing government. I think it was under Clinton. There has been talk about it in the US. I think institutional change is something, that's not, you don't really talk about it. You talk about how we need new organizations, but what is the process to get us from here to there?
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. And that, again, is why I set up the Institute, which is not just me. We have, a lot of academics that I brought in, often not from economics. So, for example, Rainer Cattell, who's my deputy director, he's, expert on kind of Weberian bureaucracies. How can we create creative bureaucracies? Why does the word bureaucratic necessarily mean something negative? We need bureaucracies, we just have the wrong kind. And I think that's the point. There's this self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's the key point of the book, which is if we pretend that the role of government at best is to fix markets, that's what you end up with. You end up with government policies and organizations that are always too little, too late. You actually have to wait for markets to fail before you do anything or even think they might fail. So it's always the worry. You're filling the gap. Even public spaces, if you look at it from an architectural point of view, are often just filling the gap of the lack of where private space does not exist. We don't actually have that kind of purpose orientation anymore, even in how we design our cities. And so I think if you do accept this idea of collective value creation, market shaping, market creation, that requires a massive design change to the instruments, which I kind of try to talk about in the book in terms of procurement, industrial strategy, but also a mind shift, and hence the need for a new curriculum, a new way to think about value. I mean, that last chapter where I talk about value as collectively created, markets as needing to be shaped, organizations in the public sector that need to be as dynamic and creative as possible, finance through an outcomes-based budgeting.
I would send my students to your school before I sent them to many of the schools that I know about here. So you have my total support for the school. I think it's a long-term process, educating a new generation.
But also in a pre-distributive way. I mean, just one super quick thing, sorry, just to make sure that we're not always too little, too late, getting these systems right in the ways that all of you, I think, have been, forcing me to talk about, is about getting the system to be right in the first place so you don't end up with the mess and having to redistribute, fix, so that kind of, also sharing the risks and the rewards, getting the same, level of confidence. I mean, my experience with so many civil servants and government organizations is that they just are incredibly insecure. They don't know how to get a good deal. Literally, the legal contracts are wrong.
Right. I believe that. Okay, here's a question from Sigrid Clack. Maybe this is stretching it too far, but given the transboundary nature of so many of today's wicked problems, can the mission-oriented approach work at a global level for wicked problems where the inputs and outputs depend on the financial commitments of member states? Or to ask it differently, why does COVAX, which you might consider as an international mission-oriented approach to provide equitable access to vaccines worldwide for 20% of the population by the end of 2021, why does it fail so miserably?
That's interesting. So, first of all, I've just agreed to chair a council for the World Health Organization called the Economics Council of Health for All. And Dr. Tedros asked me to chair it, and I recruited only women, only women economists. And when they say why, I say, why not? Think how many councils in the past were just men. But anyway, jokes aside, the goal of the council is to do the reverse of what we usually do. What we usually do in the health world, just coming to the COVAX point, is to say, invest in health because it's good for the economy. Whereas the point of the council is to say, invest in health for all globally, okay? Because that's your mission, if we can use that word that we've been using today, and then backtrack and ask, what does it mean for the economy? What does it mean for budgeting? What does it mean for how we think about debts, deficits, and our investments in global welfare states? It has to be a global health system. Had the crisis begun in Africa and not in China, we would globally be worse off. What does it mean for procurement, for design of public-private partnerships, and so on? And I think what's interesting with COVAX and why it also fails or has failed, which I'm sure there's all sorts of different interpretations on this, is it's kind of a charity model, right? I mean, what does it look like through this, again, mission-oriented lens, to go to the center of the business model, to the innovation model? I think I saw an article that said doses, just distributing doses is charity, whereas IPR is justice, right? So actually getting the proper system of intellectual property rights, not just for the vaccine. If you look at all the different therapies, I mean, look at what happened to remdesivir, which got, I think, 75 million from NIH and then gets marketed by Gilead for 3,200 per dosage. It's just another example of what I call a parasitic predator-prey ecosystem and not a symbiotic mutualistic one. So I think what we need for global challenges and missions that the question rightly asks about is to make sure that, yes, we need solidarity, we need that kind of redistributive mentality, and I think that's just as true nationally, regionally. In Europe, we could deal with a lot more solidarity than we have, and globally. But also we need to be asking, and this is the Rethinking Capitalism subtitle of the book, what it actually means for doing capitalism in a different way, for designing our innovation systems in a different way, for governing, prices and intellectual property rights in a different way. And unless we do that, then we will just constantly be relying on this kind of charitable giving or philanthropic mode of doing good. And I think, well, I'm sure you have other questions, so I don't want to go on and on, but I think that would be my main point. But the mission that I put up there before on the clean oceans, obviously that's a big global one because water moves. So no one country can actually, solve it on its own. And so I think with particular missions that do require that global cooperation, that really then requires having, again, a global mission to get serious about these global goals like the SDGs. And that means that we should also bring into that, competition policy, innovation policy, development policy, using those lenses to it. The WTO.
These are all such wicked problems. I think the idea of sharing the IPR makes good sense, but it's also true that nobody else can manufacture these if we give the IPR to Brazil or India. So we have a capitalist system that is not
but it's not about giving away the IPR. I mean, I think that's where we err. Governing IPR for the public interest means let's please at least do what Dick Nelson has been writing about for a long time, which is, or William Baumol when he said, let's not get unproductive entrepreneurship, but productive. We have allowed patents to be way too upstream, way too wide, and way too strong, hard to license. Those were decisions that were made that made that happen. There's nothing inevitable in having the current IPR system that we have, and it's not about dismantling it.
Even if you don't give it away, if you sell it, it's still. But I have one last question here from Chris Hurl, and we only have a couple of minutes left. So let's see. It says, Mariana mentioned the role and influence of external consultants like McKinsey at the beginning. I was just wondering if she could speak more about how they fit in and perhaps reflect parasitic rather than symbiotic relationships between public and private.
I think there's different, I'm actually writing a book about this. I think there's different issues. One is, and this isn't McKinsey's fault, it's not the consulting company's fault, that when you have governments no longer investing in their own capabilities, they will end up overly reliant on other actors. And it's not just the consulting companies. Again, in the US, in the UK, we have Serco, G4S, which also have done very badly in actually providing the goods and services they have, like in prisons, where there's all sorts of problems in these social structures when they're driven for profit. But you don't need me to write about that. But also, there's very little accountability often from these private providers, but also the fact that there's been this over-reliance on these external sources of management in terms of management consultants is because the state itself has stopped investing in its own capacity and has ended up with what Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement in NASA, warned about, which is to get captured by brochuremanship. When you don't know what you're doing, you are no longer investing in what the management literature would call absorptive capacity, right? Then it's not surprising that you get over-reliant. The problem is also the lack of transparency also within many of these deals and many of these consulting companies. I actually experienced it recently when I was on a commission for Italy with COVID recovery, where we were all selected to be part of this commission. And then we ended up having kind of 30 McKinsey folks around the table as well. And the idea was, oh, but we're just working for free. It's like, really? There's a lot of, sort of, different types of agreements that were being agreed on. And lo and behold, Draghi himself has now hired McKinsey to enact, to govern the process that came out of that. And you can imagine all the different projects, which all of a sudden have McKinsey consultants on those. So there's also a lack of transparency in terms of literally the contracts, the negotiations, who's paying, whose interests there are. And I think that's a whole other, issue, which I haven't really talked about, so I won't go there in the last minute. But the big theme for me about the consultants is that it's not about not working with consulting companies, that's fine, but you shouldn't be outsourcing your brain to the consulting companies. And when I helped set up that Scottish bank that I talked about, we did it for very little, basically just paid for the postdoc that helped me work on it. And I was very surprised to then see that the Scottish government then paid a very large amount of money to PwC, a consulting company, to project manage what we basically set up for pennies. And I said to the team, why are you doing that? Why not invest in your own capacity to manage this so that you can do learning by doing? And the answer was, well, it's just the project management side of things. And it's like, but that's everything. Because if you are then not managing and governing this process of a new bank in Scotland, you're not learning from that process, and you will not be investing within your own capability to govern this process in a way, again, in the public interest. So this idea that it's just about project management is a huge failure.
So we will very much look forward to this forthcoming book on public-private and consulting. It sounds like it'll be fascinating. Listen, I want to thank everyone for a really tremendous and interesting panel. Thank you first to Mariana for being so game to entertain all of our questions. I think the interaction was really interesting and fun. Thanks to all the panelists as well. You all had really interesting commentary and gave us lots to think about. And thanks to SASE for setting up a really great panel. Thanks all.
Thanks to you, Anna, and thanks to everyone. Really, I'm so grateful. It feels like a huge gift you've given me of spending time with me on a book. I hope I can exchange it and talk about your work on a similar panel for this conference. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Bye all.